Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today will be the final video of the series I've done about John Lennon from the book Nowhere Man. So in this video, we reach the end of John's journal, and a majority of this video, we learn about Mark David Chapman and see what led him to kill John Lennon. So if this is upsetting to you, I understand if you don't want to see the video. It's tragic that a madman took away a great talent, a father, a friend, a husband, a nephew, and other great things that made John Lennon who he was. But let us continue. In December, Double Fantasy was in the top 10 in all the trade magazines. Starting Over, the single was number 4, and John Praised God. December 3rd, the Soho Weekly News had an article about Yoko. She had a photo on the cover, and there was a headline that read, Yoko Only. A servant came in the room and handed the magazine to Yoko, but John was so excited he grabbed it out of her hand. John told the servant to buy 100 more copies and have one framed. So Yoko had been working hard on her single and video Thin Ice, and John said to Yoko, "You got a hit, mother." And then John found out that 200,000 copies were sold in the United Kingdom, and John couldn't believe it. It made up for the time she had been treated badly in England, and which is why they had left in the country in the first place. On December the 6th, John had called Mimi and said he was planning to return to England and he would see her soon. So December the 8th, John and Yoko did an interview with David Sholin of RKO Radio Network, and this was his last interview. So he was kind of telling how he started his day. "I get up at 6 and go to the kitchen, get a cup of coffee, cough a little, have a cigarette. Papers arrive at 7, he said. Sean gets up at 7:20, 7:25, and I oversee his breakfast. I don't cook anymore. I got fed up with that one, but I make sure I know what he's eating." And after the interview, they went to the record plant to work on Thin Ice. And when he got back to the Dakota, it was 11 p.m. So John and Yoko thought they were the reincarnation of the Victorian poets Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. On the last page of his diary, Lennon had copied a verse from the Browning's poem entitled Rabbi Ben Ezra. He liked the lines so much he used them in his own song that ended up on the album Milk and Honey, and it was, "Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be." And then John was shot to death on December the 8th, 1980 at 11 p.m. in the archway of the Dakota. Okay, the book then has the author talking about Mark David Chapman. He stated that Mark lived in Honolulu, and Mark went to Hawaii initially to see Waikiki. Rosen said that Honolulu was no place for a complete outsider to live. He chose Hawaii to start a new life, a new job, a new beginning. And he had found a wife. She was an older Japanese woman named Gloria Abe, and she had been his travel agent. And other than that, he didn't find much there. So the weather was kind of oppressive and the salary was low. The mental hospitals and the jails were overflowing, and Mark kept searching for a job there. By March 1980, Chapman was comparing himself to Holden Caulfield. The author, Robert Rosen, described Holden as being young, slightly mad, somewhat cowardly, hypocrisy-hating hero of the book The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Chapman would go to the library to escape the heat, and there were free books to read, of course, and he found the book Catcher in the Rye, and he read it over and over again. He felt like he was reading his autobiography. He felt the book showed him hope and salvation, and he felt the book showed who he was. And he gave a copy to his wife, and he told her to read it so she could know him. So this is where things get creepy. It was when he was at the library going down the aisle of books, he came upon a book about John Lennon, and it was titled John Lennon, One Day at a Time. He started flipping through the book, looking at the pictures, and the book was by Anthony Fawcett, one of John Lennon's personal assistants. He was with John before 1975, and that was before John went into seclusion. It was a book that said good things about John Lennon, but Mark was taking things the wrong way. Chapman was mad that John was living in New York. He thought he should be in England with the rest of the Beatles, and he felt like the Dakota looked like the Wicked Witch's castle in The Wizard of Oz, and that was his favorite movie. It was in that Chapman thought that John Lennon was a phony. "All you need is love. Imagine no possessions." Yeah, right, no possessions for me because you have everything. He felt that John was a rich businessman just like all the others. Chapman was jealous John was happy in New York with more fame than was imaginable, and that everything money could buy he could get, and Chapman was stuck in Honolulu with nothing. Later in the week, John goes back to the library to play records, and he would normally listen to Todd Rundgren. Chapman thinks that he was a genius superior to John Lennon. But this time he picks out the Plastic Ono Band and he listens to the song God. And Chapman, he believed in God, and he's mad that John doesn't. Mark David Chapman had lived in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia before going to Hawaii. He probably wasn't that sane there, but in the 3 years that he lived in Hawaii, he went off the deep end somehow. So Chapman stopped taking LSD when he was about 14. When he did do the drug, he liked to listen to the Magical Mystery Tour, and the picture of John on the inside of the Sgt. Pepper and his voice on Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds made him realize that John must die, so he asked Satan to help him do it. So once he made up his mind to do it, the hurt went away, and he started to feel sane, and he felt clear like he'd never felt anything before. So Chapman in Hawaii, he was there from May 1977. He failed everything while he was there, including suicide. He tried to kill himself with carbon monoxide from his car exhaust. He was in and out of mental hospitals and had menial jobs, a lot of them. He wanted to be recognized as a somebody. To do that, he ran up debts, spending weekends with his wife at expensive Waikiki beachfront hotels, and he rented luxury cars. Since he made a goal, things seemed to fall in place. So this part shows what a delusional person he was. Chapman saw the return of the little people. They were a civilization of men and women and kids that had lived in his head and in the walls of his room since he was a child. And when he was a child, he was their dictator, and his image would be on a TV screen, and he gave speeches. And when he became an adult, they helped him make decisions, usually regarding his finances. Now he wanted to ask them about wanting to murder John Lennon. So he made the little people a democracy once he was an adult. So they told him, don't do it. It would cause pain for the people he cared about, his wife and his mother. Chapman disagreed with the little people, so too bad he didn't take their advice. He asked them, didn't they understand he needed to kill John Lennon? And they said they did, but they couldn't condone it. They were good Christians, and they didn't want any part of his plan, and they decided to abandon him. Chapman decided he needed inspiration, money, a gun, and he needed to get to New York. He could get the money easily because he was an art collector. He sold a $5,000 Salvador Dali gold plaque. He had gotten a loan from his father-in-law to pay for it. And he also got a $2,500 loan from his mother to get a Norman Rockwell print titled Triple Self-Portrait. So he sold them to a collector for a profit. Well, he got his inspiration by listening to the old Beatles and John Lennon albums for hours on end. The lies in the song made him angry. He thought he would have nothing to worry about once he killed John Lennon, and he thought he would become the fictional character Holden Caulfield. And then there was a new chapter, chapter 27. That would be when the chapter would be written in John Lennon's blood. And he bought a gun for $169 and paid for it in cash. On the day he signed out of his security guard job, he used the name John Lennon, and he told his wife he was going to New York. His wife was old-fashioned, and so she didn't protest when he said he was leaving. He arrived in New York October the 29th, and he spent a week there. And Chapman, he liked New York. He followed the idea of his fictional character, Holden Caulfield, and checked into a hotel. The first 2 nights he stayed at the Waldorf Astoria, and then he moved to the Olcott on 72nd Street, right next to the Dakota. Money started to run low, so he checked into the YMCA on 63rd Street and Central Park West, 9 blocks from the Dakota. And then Chapman started to hang out at the front of the Dakota. And he kept asking the doorman if John Lennon was home today, and the doorman didn't say anything to him. They thought he was just a fan and harmless. When he wasn't camping out at the Dakota, he took in a few Broadway shows, and he ate dinner at lavish restaurants. And when he met people, he would tell them he was going to do something they would hear about. He was going to be a celebrity. It upset him when they didn't seem to understand what he was saying, or they didn't believe him. So Chapman got frustrated at all the time he spent out in front of the Dakota, and he never saw John. On November the 4th, he felt he would see John soon, so he needed to get ammunition for his gun. He found out that you couldn't buy bullets legally in New York City. It was then he decided to fly to Georgia to see his friend Dana Reeves, and he was the sheriff's deputy. So Chapman told his friend he was going to be in New York City and needed protection. and he wanted to get hollow point bullets to stop a man in case he was mugged. So Reeves, he didn't think anything about it. He got the bullets for Mark and showed him how to shoot out in the woods, and Chapman wasn't that good, but then Reeves showed him some pointers, like standing in a combat stance, and the training made Chapman much better. So then Chapman returned to New York, November the 8th, flying first class, and he saw a magazine on the rack, and John Lennon was on the cover. The story stated that Lennon was an isolated multi-millionaire businessman who became the antithesis of everything he once represented. So that inspired Chapman once more to want to kill Lennon. So it was at this time that he never got to see John, so he called his wife Gloria to tell her, "I know you're not going to believe me, but I was going to kill John Lennon." She said she believed him and told him, "Please come home." So Chapman did go home, but he couldn't get John Lennon out of his mind. He felt he had to go back and finish what he started. So Mark's mother suspected something might be up, because when he told her he needed to go back to New York to take care of unfinished business, she asked him, "You're not going to do anything funny, Mark, are you?" And he said no. So when he got back to New York City, he decided to stay at the YMCA so he wouldn't run out of money. But he didn't like it there because he was hearing two young men making love in the next room, and that put him in a fit of rage. He wanted to shoot through the walls and kill them, but he controlled himself. He said he thought to himself, killing those men, he wouldn't be able to kill John Lennon. So to get away from them, he moves to a nicer hotel, the Sheridan Center on 7th Avenue and 52nd Street. And near there, he buys a copy of Playboy magazine with the John Lennon interview. He found it fascinating that they sometimes hired fans off the street. November 7th, he starts to feel lonely and decides to hire a prostitute, just like Holden did in the book. And he gets one from the Yellow Pages. He tells her to take off her dress and get in bed with him. He said he didn't want anything, so Chapman was confused about sex, had pleasure in touching and being touched, but he didn't like the intimate act itself. So he had a feeling that that day was going to be the day, and he put the gun in his coat pocket and his Double Fantasy album under his arm. On the 7th Avenue, he bought a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. He felt he had been without the book too long. So it was that day that Chapman saw Lennon coming out of the Dakota that afternoon. But thoughts of murder weren't in his mind because he was finally seeing his childhood idol. He wanted to get John's autograph, so he walked up to Lennon holding out the album, but he was too starstruck to speak. So Lennon took the album out of his hands and signed it. Chapman remembered the interview about hiring people off the street and began to think he would like to work at the Dakota. And he asked John if he was hiring anybody, and John told him to send in a resume. Then Chapman spends the rest of the day in front of the Dakota. He kept reading Catcher in the Rye. It gave him comfort and was giving him courage. So at 11 o'clock that night, the white limo pulls up, and Chapman knows who's in there. And from the archway, Chapman sees Yoko, and then Lennon emerged from the limo and walked past him. Chapman then calls out, "Mr. Lennon," and goes into a combat stance. He pulls the trigger, and then he shot Lennon 5 times in the back and arm. When Chapman is arrested, he's questioned by psychiatrists to figure out why he would want to do something like that. But Chapman got what he wanted. He wasn't a loser anymore. He was a famous murderer. When he was going to his cell, he heard Walter Cronkite say his name on the TV. The psychiatrists find he's a willing patient, and one psychiatrist couldn't figure out if he was crazy or not. She said he had an insatiable need for attention and recognition. The defense psychiatrist said that there was an entire race of little people living in his head. They thought he was psychotic. And other defense psychiatrists say he was fighting a battle of good and evil. So Chapman, months before his trial, says in Rikers Island that "I murdered John Lennon to promote The Catcher in the Rye. John Lennon had to die so everybody could read the book." And somehow he got a carton of books of The Catcher in the Rye, and he handed them out to everybody he met in jail, and he autographed each copy. And he pled not guilty by reason of insanity, a suggestion made by his lawyer. But on June 22nd, 1981, he decides to plead guilty to murder. He said God told him to say that. So everyone thinks the reason Chapman did it was for fame. And when Chapman faced the judge, he had a copy of The Catcher in the Rye in his hands, and he started to read the passage as his final words. So in the book, Caulfield tells his little sister Phoebe what he wants to do with his life. And so the character says, anyway, I keep picturing all these little kids playing some game in the big field of rye and all. Thousands of little kids, and nobody's around. Nobody big, I mean, except me. And I'm standing on the edge of some crazy cliffs. What I have to do, I have to catch everybody if they start to fall off the cliff. I mean, if they're running and they don't look where they're going, I have to come out from the somewhere and catch them. So that's what I do all day. I be the catcher in the rye and all. And so it sounded like he murdered John Lennon to save little children. He sounded crazy, but he felt proud of because he did what he set out to do. So at the moment, he's serving his sentence at the Green Havens Correctional Facility north in New York City. In August 22nd, 2022, Mark David Chapman was denied parole for the 12th time. In the year 2020, at the parole hearing, he said, I assassinated him because he was very, very, very famous, and that's the only reason. And I was very, 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 very much seeking self-glory. Very selfish, Chapman said. His next parole hearing will be February 2024. Hopefully he never sees the light of day again. So John Lennon was beginning to see success once again, and when he came out of seclusion to do Double Fantasy, he was excited about his life and how well the album was doing. He was glad to see Yoko getting great press and proud of how her single Thin Ice was doing in the UK. He was starting to become nostalgic about his days in England and told Aunt Mimi he was going to be visiting soon. It's a shame he didn't get to enjoy the new chapter in his life. Now the man who killed him feels remorse, all out of wanting to be famous himself. How he thought being famous by murdering someone famous, especially a person he admired, is really twisted. So he deserves to be alone with his thoughts for the rest of his days. I'm sorry for a video that relives that terrible day, but the book Nowhere Man wrote of it, and most people want to know why Chapman wanted to do something so terrible, and his reason for it makes things worse. But I hope everybody's been having a good day, and I hope you tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.